The purpose of this video is to discuss the development of a RESTful API service from a database table. This will introduce you to the Java Persistent API, or JPI, and its communication with the database. The RESTful service will rely on an entity class and persistence unit to manage the service's data requirements. We will create a RESTful service that will allow clients to manage the market data stored in the sample database. So we can view that data, and this is we're going to create a RESTful service that's going to manage this data. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new project. It's going to be a Maven project, and it'll be a web application. And we're going to call this application Manufacturer Service. And our package is going to be org.usd.csci.manufacturer REST service. So now we're going to create a RESTful web service from the database. So we're going to right click on our project and say New, Other. And we're going to select Web Services. And we're going to do a RESTful web service from database. And the database is our sample database. And the table we want to use is the manufacturer table. We want to call this manufacturer entity. And we're going to put it in org.usd.csci manufacturer REST service.data. And our service package is going to be org.usd.csci.manufacturerservice.service. So NetBeans creates a number of files for us. So we can see it creates our entity class that represents the database table. The table is the manufacturer table. It generated our named queries for us. And this is our entity class. And we have an attribute for each column in the table. It also created for us our entity facade. So this is a combination of our RESTful service and the facade that we use for managing the database in the data in the entity. So it provides the create, read, update, and delete functionality that we need for managing data. And it also has our post, our put, our delete, our gets that are required for our RESTful service. So for example, in our manufacturer entity facade REST, we have a create method, and our create method is executed through our service when a client submits a post. And this create method calls the abstract facades create method. And the abstract facades create method executes a persist. So our entity manager persists this entity, which basically our entity manager will put the data that's in this entity in the database table. So our client submits a post sending in a JSON string representing an entity, and the entity manager knows how to convert that into an entity and puts it in the database. So one of the first things we're going to do is we only want to deal with JSON format. We don't want to deal with XML format. So we're going to delete the XML option from our service. So our service is only going to handle JSON. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to change our path. Notice that NetBeans put sort of a complex path. They put the entire package of our entity. And we're going to change that to just our manufacturer entity, making it just easier for our clients to call our service. And lastly, I'm going to change our persistence unit's name, because again, it's a little more complicated than it needs to be. So I need to change this in 2 places. So I'm going to change it here. And my persistent unit name is going to be manufacturer REST service PU. And then I also need to change it in the persistence XML. So we can run our service. And we should be able to see an array list or a JSON array of a list of all the manufacturers in the table. So at this point, what we would want to do is implement business rules. The first thing we would do is we would go to our entity class, so our manufacturer entity, and we would add any validation constraints that we would need to use to enter in order to implement business rules. So for example, if we know that the zip code is to be 5 digits and the first digit cannot be a 0, we could write that we would import JavaX validation constraints pattern. So if we add the regular expression pattern that says we'll accept 5 digits, we say reg express, it has to, the first digit is 1 through 9, and we can say that that's at the beginning of our file, or the beginning of our string, and then 0 through 9, and that's 4 digits, and we'll specify that that is the ending. So all we're going to accept is 5 digits where the first digit has to be 1 through 9. And we would add any other business rules, any other constraint validation constraints that we need to add to these columns to make sure that the data that gets entered into these attributes and thus into the database is valid information. So in addition to adding our business rules to our entity B, there's other business rules that we would want to add to our manufacturer entity facade REST. If you look at create, it just, when this method is executed, so when a post comes in to add an entity to the database, it's just done blindly. So there's a couple of things that we want to do. Firstly, we want to make sure that the entity that we're adding to the database meets the business rules. And if it does, we want to make sure that the user gets a response back saying everything is okay. And at the same time, if there is a problem, we want to inform the client that it was a bad request. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to change the return value on this method from create, from void to response. And we're going to import JavaX WSRS core response. Notice now that we get an error message because what we're doing is overriding the create method that's in the abstract facade class. And that method has a return value of void, and we've changed it to response. So we need to go to our abstract class, and we need to change the return value to response. So in our abstract facade, given any entity, we could say if our entity is equal to null, we want to return response status, and we want to return a bad request. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and let the entity manager try to put this entity in the database. If something goes wrong when it tries to persist that entity, maybe it couldn't connect to the database or something else goes wrong and it throws an exception, we want to return a bad request. Otherwise, if everything goes right, we want to return OK. Now returning back to our manufacturer facade, now everything is okay because it's assuming that the method that we're overriding returns a response. So those errors have gone away. But we still need to return whatever happens when we call the facade. So we'll return the response that gets generated by calling this method. So if the entity we pass to it is null, it's going to return a bad request. If it wasn't able to put it in the database, it's going to return a bad request. Otherwise, it's going to return OK. But there may be other business rules that we want to add at this point. For example, there may be a business rule that says that manufacturer name must be unique. So we want to implement this here. We can't implement it in the entity class because the entity doesn't know about all the other entities. So at this point, we have to check to see if that entity exists before we make sure that that manufacturer name doesn't exist. And if it does, we're going to return a bad request. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and create it in the database. So given the business rule that entity name must be unique, we're going to implement it here. So in order to implement it, we need to have a method find by name. So we're going to create here a private method find by name, and we're going to pass in the name. And if it's found, it's going to return null. It's going to return that manufacturer entity, and otherwise it's going to return null. So if name is equal to null, we're going to return null. So we're going to execute a named query. And the name of our query, we're going to get that from our entity class. So our entity class should have a find by name. Find by name. So this is the named query that we're going to execute. Find by name. And we need to tell the entity manager that it's going to return a manufacturer entity class. Java persistent typed query is what we need to import. We need to set our name parameter. In this get single results, it's going to return a manufacturer entity if it finds a manufacturer with that name. Otherwise, it's going to return null. So now we have our find by name method. Now in our create, before we put the entity in the database, we want to make sure that no entity with that name already exists. So we're going to take the name of the entity that we're going to create. We're going to go look for it in the database. If it wasn't found, local manufacturer will be null. If it was found, it will not be null. So if it's not null, that means it was found in the database. So if our local manufacturer is not equal to null, that means it was found in the database. And we want to return a bad request. And we would do the same thing with edit, except for in edit, we want to make sure so in this case, in edit, if the name already exists in the database and its ID is different from the entity ID, that means the name would not be unique. So we would need to enforce that business rule in the edit.